On the first one, you have sine plus tangent over 1 plus secant. The first thing you always want to do is to change everything into terms of sine and cosine. So first you'll bring down sine, and then tangent is always sine over cosine. Then over 1 plus secant, which is the inverse of cosine, so 1 over cosine. And since you can't have a fraction within a fraction, you'll need to cancel out these two cosines. So you'll do that by multiplying this entire thing by cosine over cosine. It's kind of squished, but it's there. So cosine times sine equals sine cosine. Cosine times sine over cosine, cancel out the cosines, and it's just sine. 1 times cosine is just cosine, and then cosine times 1 over cosine, the cosines cancel out, and you have 1. Then coming down, you can see you can factor out a sine from this top part of the equation. So sine, then sine cosine divided by sine is cosine, and then sine divided by cosine is 1. And you see that you have cosine plus 1 on both the top and the bottom, so you can cancel that out, and so your answer is just sine. You first bring down the sine, then cosecant becomes 1 over sine. Sine times secant squared is sine times 1 over cosine squared. So doing multiplication first, you'll get sine over cosine squared plus 1 over sine multiplied by sine. To add these two together, you'll need to multiply each one by a form of 1 that will get the same denominator. So for 1 over sine, that would be cosine squared over cosine squared. I'll just write that to abbreviate, and that gets cosine squared over cosine sine plus, I'll just continue this. Then you'll have to multiply each of these by sine. That gets you this common denominator. The sine times sine will be sine squared. And we know that cosine squared plus sine squared is the same as 1. So that can be 1 over cosine squared sine squared. Or no. 1 over cosine squared sine, and multiplied by this sine, which needs to be brought down. So you'll get sine over cosine squared sine, and these two sines cancel out. So your answer, the inverse of 1 over cosine squared, or the inverse of cosine is secant. So your answer is secant squared. Okay, question E has a lot of fractions involved. First thing you'll want to do is bring down this 2 over 1 minus cosine minus 2 over 1 plus cosine. I would keep the cotangent just as it is for now, so you don't have to worry about canceling that out. Then to cancel out these fractions, you would need to multiply them together to get the same common denominator. So 1 minus cosine, 1 cosine, these cancel out like the last one. and you get 1 minus cosine squared. You could simplify that to sine squared, but that would make it harder to cancel out these fractions. So you would multiply this entire fraction, all of it, by 1 minus cosine squared. And so taking 1 cosine out of this leaves you with 1 plus cosine, so that's what you're multiplying 2 by, which I have down here, 2 times 1 plus cosine. And then bringing it over here, you have 1 plus cosine, and you'll want to take that out of from 1 minus cosine squared, and that leaves you with 1 minus cosine, which you multiply the other 2 by. And as for the bottom, you just multiply 1 minus cosine squared times cotangent, which down here I've shown as sine squared. Simplifying that would be easier over here. And I've simplified cotangent to cosine over sine, because tangent is sine over cosine, and the inverse of that would be cosine over sine. The next step would be to multiply these out and bring that down, which would be 2 plus 2 cosine minus 2 plus 2 cosine. And you see that these two numbers cancel out, and you can just add these two together to get 4 cosine down there. As for the bottom, the denominator, you can just multiply across, and you'll get cosine sine squared over sine, and the sine squared cancels out with the sine on bottom, and you get down here cosine sine, and with your numerator. From there you can cancel out the signs, and you have 4 over sine, but since you don't want a fraction in your answer, you simplify it to cosecant, so your answer is 4 cosecant. With the tangent squared, you just have to remember that both the sine and the cosine will be squared, so tangent squared is equal to sine squared over cosine squared. You can't just square one. And for the denominator, secant is 1 over cosine, and you need to remember to add the 1. This one is forgotten a lot, and you need to bring that down. So for this fraction, you need to cancel out the cosine squared and the cosine, to do which you just need to multiply everything by cosine squared. So that cancels out this cosine squared down on the bottom, and that leaves you with just sine squared right here. And then multiplying cosine squared by 1 over cosine leaves you with cosine plus cosine squared. And then to bring this 1 down, I just converted it into the same converted it to use the same denominator so that they can easily be added together, the two fractions. So cosine plus cosine squared over cosine plus cosine squared, that's equal to 1, but it's easier to add to this, which has that as the same denominator. So bringing down the fraction, you keep that denominator, and you just add these two parts. So you have sine squared plus cosine squared, and you can see here you have you have sine squared and cosine squared, which equal 1. They add up together to equal 1. And then this, you can bring it down. So 1 plus cosine, that's the top. And then you can factor out a cosine from the bottom to get both 1 plus cosine on the top and bottom of the fraction, and that cancels out and leaves you with 1 over cosine, and so the inverse, and that's the inverse of secant. So that's your answer. So F is a pretty short problem. First thing you'll have to do is multiply each individual fraction by the opposite fraction's denominator. Moving on to f, the first step is to convert the secants into 1 over cosine, because that's the inverse. You'll want to bring down these two fractions. The only thing you're changing there is the 1 over cosine. And to get rid of that, you'll need to multiply both fractions by cosine over cosine. So cosine times sine get you cosine sine, and then distributing out the cosine on the bottom will cancel these out and give you 1 down here, and then minus cosine. And pretty much the same thing on this side, distributing the cosine except with a plus. Then once you have these two fractions, you'll need to multiply this first one by 1 plus cosine over 1 plus cosine to get the same common denominator as the other fraction. Multiplying it out comes down here, and you'll have cosine sine plus cosine squared sine plus sine cosine minus sine cosine squared. Then you can cancel out these two sine cosine squared, and that leaves you with 2 cosine sine. And the bottom of the fraction that multiplies out from 1 minus cosine multiplied by 1 plus cosine equals 1 minus cosine squared, which we know 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared. So then you come down to the bottom and you cancel out the sine with the sine squared, and that gives you cosine over sine, which is cotangent, so your answer is 2 cotangent. For problem H, you can try that on your own. You can pause the video, and then when you unpause it, I'll work through that. I started by bringing down this top part of the fraction, and I was working with that first. You'll want to remember this bottom part. I actually brought that down later, since this top part is pretty complicated. So secant is 1 over cosine minus tangent, which is sine over cosine, multiplied by secant 1 over cosine plus tangent sine over cosine. These are pretty easily added and subtracted because they all have common denominators. So that's just 1 minus sine over cosine multiplied by 1 plus sine over cosine. So multiplying the 1 minus sine, 1 plus sine out, that is 1 minus sine squared, which is the same as cosine squared, which you can see with the sine squared plus cosine squared equation. So bringing that down, the numerator is cosine squared over the denominator, which is cosine times cosine, also cosine squared. So this fraction, which is the top part of this, is 1. Then bringing down this cosine, you have 1 over cosine, and your answer is secant.